Hello, guys. This is me, Dr. Anatole, and we have Mike behind the camera.
Hello.
And we're experimenting. Mike is eating his lunch, which probably not going to last very long. And we're in, well, at least I am playing with the background. And this is actually, I am now set behind a photo that I took a few years ago in the Arches National Park in Moab, Utah, which is probably by far my favorite place in the United States. There is a good chance that I'm going to end up moving there in a couple years or so. So, and what you see above my head is I think it's the longest arch in the United States or in North America, or maybe the second largest or the third largest in the world. But it is most certainly the longest arch in the Arches National Park. So that's a little bit of a background on the background. And yes, I walked there with my camera. Mike, what would you like to talk about today, or should we talk about today?
Well, at the end of one of our other recording sessions, we started a conversation that we didn't record. So I had a question that I thought was a small question, but actually could be a big and basic question, which is whether wisdom has some sort of time limit. And what I mean by that, or if there's a time bar. And what I mean by that really is, there are certain religions or cults, or I mean, this is true whether you're even talking about religions. There are books that people say, read this after you're 40, or read this after you're 60, or read this after you're a parent, or etc. So is there wisdom that's only accessible after you've lived through some experience? Or is that just kind of an excuse for people to withhold wisdom and knowledge from others?
This is a big question. I guess I have several thoughts. One is that I think that wisdom is frequently confused with maturity. And I think they are related to each other, but I don't think they're the same thing. And that's how you can talk to a 5-year-old who will tell you some absolutely amazing, wildly wise things, while we can talk about spiritual maturity of a 5-year-old, but certainly 5-year-old in this particular life is not well, not mature. He or she is a child. So that's one thing that comes to my mind. Another thing is that, who is there to tell you what to read or what to do, unless you're talking about maybe legally, or maybe someone who supposedly knows you better, like say your parents, and we can have a very long conversation about why that is not necessarily true. Ultimately, you decide what you're ready for or not. Surely from your, I don't know, more years than someone who is younger than you, you can see that another person is younger than you. And they might be not ready for something, but try to tell to a 20-year-old that they're not ready for something, and chances are you're going to get a reaction. People, especially when we're young, we don't understand, what does it mean to be ready or not ready for something, and many times we misassess that both ways. An older person may misassess how ready a younger person is for something, and vice versa. A younger person may do something which will turn out to be premature in the retrospect. In any case, all of these things about reading something after you're 40 or whatever is a guideline. It's not really, there's I always laugh about that story how in the Jewish mystic tradition, the Kabbalah, Zohar, which you're not supposed to read until you're 40 or something like that, was written by a 25-year-old. So so it's like what does that mean really? So that's one thing. Another thing, I think it's absurd to think that someone who has less experience has more experience. It's also absurd to think that there is no such thing as being ready for something, etc. And just because something is really abstract, as wisdom is, does not mean there are no levels or phases, as we call it in our modern Sears Vortices book and beyond. The thing is, like, look at say, look at high school or look at college. If you take calculus 3 before you have calculus 1 and 2, you may discover that there are limits to your natural smarts. You may be not prepared, you may be missing some concepts, and more importantly, you may be missing the experience, the practice of doing calculus at that lower level. And all you're doing really in that situation is creating an unnecessary difficulty, which would have been completely taken care of if you have taken calculus 1 and 2 before calculus 3. The same way, I mean, I know very well what happens if you take a person who is spiritually not quite mature in an environment where spiritual pressure is very high, and at best they'll have enough wisdom to leave that situation, or if they persist, they can freak out and they can damage themselves psychologically, and worse, they can damage themselves physically. And it does happen. There are some practices that are very dangerous. There are some practices that are dangerous for the opposite gender. So there are practices for women who are not that are not good for men, and vice versa. And if a person is stupid enough for some sentimental reasons, it usually happens to women. They try to do practices for men because they think that they should do all the practices, and then they discover unsavory things happen to them on a physical level or a psychological level. And it's, ignoring experiences, ignoring the experience of, previous generations is, well, there is a reason why that experience was there. There's a reason why they wrote about it. There is a reason why there are lineages of teachers. It is one way of transmitting a certain kind of knowledge. Now, no one is saying that that knowledge is perfect. And ultimately, when you partake of that knowledge, you will be called one way or another to make a contribution to that knowledge. At worst, by your own experience, by your own processing of that knowledge through through your own body, mind, and spirit, and and possibly writing something down, possibly training other people who will look at you and say, "Oh wow, you're so smart, you're so knowledgeable, you're so amazing, but we are more amazing and more smart, and we can do further." I mean, that's how science works, and that's how authentic spiritual traditions continue. And that's part of the reason why I'm not too happy about people taking some 2000 or whatever 100-year-old scripture and assuming that the questions and the answers that are in that scripture apply 100% to our world. It can't be, because every generation asks same questions but in a different ways, because there's a different context, there's a different culture, there are different I don't know, well, that's good enough: culture, context, language, time, issues. And older generation, but living older generation, can most certainly contribute to the younger generation. And one of the big problems that we have in America in particular, but I would say in Europe slightly less, and in Asia probably even less so, and that is that we have a youth-oriented culture, which means there's a culture, we have a very pronounced culture where youth is being favored in favor of more experienced older generation. So the passing of the knowledge from the older generation is warped, is messed up. And because of that, all we get is that less mature younger generation, the mature later, also younger generation does not absorb knowledge from the older generation well enough. So they end up making the same mistakes again and again and again. And at least like in my case, because I rely very much on the knowledge of previous generations, even it may not appear so when I talk, but I most certainly do. I many times, like if I discover that a person has a really loaded sentiment against people who know more, it just speaks to that person's immaturity from the wisdom point of view, because someone who thinks that they are more mature at 20 than someone at 40 is an idiot by definition. That of course needs to be properly put in the context. It's not like all older people are so much smarter and so much wiser. That's just not true. We all know about it. We know lots of people who are at 80 years old, have the mentality of a 13-year-old, and I wouldn't use them for example, to put it crassly. But to dismiss that every person who has more experience than you doesn't have that experience, well, it's an interesting way to protect your fragile ego from the reality that you could use some more maturity. And I'll let you comment.
No, that sounds about right.
Yeah, I mean, listen, here's what I'm trying to say. It's not like, you are better or worse than other people. It's not about that. It's just, when you go to a professor at the university, there is a reason why you're studying calculus with that professor rather than by yourself, because it is faster, it's more efficient. So when you deal with someone who has more experience than you, it's not about that person having power over you. Of course, they do have power over you in some ways, but they always have power over you, because someone who is more experienced and wiser than you can manipulate you much better than you think they can. And you can see it right now in the United States. It's kind of endemic because of that the stupidity of youth-oriented culture. But I'm not going to go into this. If you have eyes to see, whether you're 15 or 55, you can readily observe what I'm talking about right now. It's just a way to do things more efficiently. So, for example, there are some hidden treasures and also hidden dangers on the path of spirituality. These hidden dangers, it's just dumb for you try to rediscover them. I mean, why would you want to go in a water that has sharks in it and you don't know about these sharks? If you can know about these sharks, and you can find out which one is going to bite you on the left buttock or on the right buttock, or maybe it will not bite you at all if you know how to whatever, well, basically not go in a shark effect, infested waters. And it may be an extreme example, but that's how these things go. It's that simple. I mean, frankly, if you're a rebel and you say, "Oh my God, I know everything and I'm 20 years old," well, you don't. But the only way to progress spiritually or emotionally or intellectually is you go forward. You go forward by yourself, or you go forward with the help of another person. And most importantly, you need, as we say in Russian, trust but verify. You need to see who you're dealing with. It's that simple, including yourself. You need to examine your own motivations and see how you react to certain things. But it's always, you know, like in my case, I always get surprised when people come to me and they want to learn from me, but then if you tell them to do something, they rebel against it. And we're talking about silly things, small things. So if you can't take instructions, well, who is an idiot then? You know? And that goes back to, you know, reading books. I mean, do you seriously think that, you know, spiritual teachers tell you not to read something until you're 40 because they want to have power over you? Really? Seriously? You know how, you know, immature that would be. They are advising you about this because it will be better for you. Most of the time. It's the same thing when you go to a doctor. Most doctors do not tell you to do something because they want to have power over you. They want to help you. Not all of them, of course, but mostly that's how the things go. And yes, it is up to you to decide which doctor wishes you better than otherwise.
I'm struggling with the analogy in some ways because I still have to bring this back to why we even have these conversations in the first place. Uh, and that is, you know, to some extent, we're not necessarily learning a finite science. We're not doing medicine. We're not learning a finite math system that already exists that is complicated per se. But we're talking about, you know, spiritual learning, right? Or growing in your wisdom or things to that extent. And unfortunately, there are a lot of systems that humans put in place, and I don't mean individuals necessarily, but they are power systems that kind of do keep you from getting where you may want to go.
Well, I mean, you're bringing up a very, very good point. And I have several things to say about it. We can have, you know, 5 hours discussion about this. But the bottom line of it is that you do get what you deserve. You can believe in karma or not believe in karma, but basically, when you come to a system and you do not do due diligence to check out a particular system or a teacher, however limited your abilities are and however limited your experience is, your heart is not limited, and your, you know, sixth sense is not limited, and you can kind of tell if someone is screwing around with you. And that's one thing I want to say. Another thing is that let's not confuse religious traditions with spiritual traditions. And they're not the same, and they are probably in many, many ways, hidden that it may be, they contradict each other. Basically, spiritual traditions are always liberal, open, oriented towards progress, and religious traditions are the opposite. They tend to be conservative, they're oriented towards staying put, they're oriented towards maintaining status quo, which is basically about power. So, and progressive things are about transferring, well, let's call it transferring power to, well, let's call it new generation, transferring to people who now emerging, or, you know, as a new leader, so to speak. So, say, for example, as a younger man, you discover something that is really useful for humanity and useful for those individuals who are ostensibly on a spiritual path. Don't you think you should share that? And don't you think that that is going to be disliked by people who are thinking that they have the, you know, the license, the, you know, the exclusive license for their version of the spiritual path, which sounds ridiculous in the first place. You know, what is that? You know, how could that be? But it happens all the time. You know, you go to a guru, to a teacher, and that teacher has to keep your ego in check, has to, you know, assume some sort of power over you initially. But a true teacher, which you should definitely check, at the other end of the equation, will let you go or sometimes kick you out into the open world, because his or her purpose was never to have power over you, but to train you in a certain way so that you would have access to certain understanding and grow by yourself. So part of the training always, initially you need to develop that kind of trust, and you need to let go a little bit and let another person direct your life to some extent. Otherwise, why bother? And then that person will let you out when he or she will decide that you're getting close to ready. And none of this is always perfect. Sometimes you have to rebel and go for it, and sometimes you don't. Like in my case, I most certainly rebelled, not against my teacher, but against his organization, which I never really respected, to be honest. So for me, I mean, I'm sensitive about this. I mean, I realize that people are coming to me not to have me their little king or duke or whatever. So that's what it is. So I mean, all of these things. Now, anytime you're dealing with human relationships, however divine they pretend to be or tend to be, you will have that human aspect, and you have to account for it. And depending on your maturity and level of wisdom, depending on your age or whatever, or independent of your age, you will have certain effects directed at you. And there's nothing much you can do about it, but you can certainly keep your eyes and heart open, and and check things out. I've forgotten who was saying this, the Dalai Lama or my Indian guru, that that Westerners tend to accept teachers very quickly because they don't do due diligence, and in the East they wait forever because in that culture there's so many stories about horrible experiences people had with gurus that they test the guru for so long that it becomes kind of useless, So it has to be some kind of middle ground where you hang out around a teacher or his or her tradition or all of the above until you see that things are going in the right direction. But if you have emotional, psychological issues, you're looking for a father figure. If you're codependent and you really need to have counseling, etc., then you may get sucked into basically sucked into a cult, which happens a lot. And if you're lucky, the teacher knows how to deal with that. If you're unlucky, he or she, the teacher that is on a prowl to grab people like you, and you'll get abused. And you will not know about it until like 20, 30 years later. That can happen. Should you not do it then? Just run away? Well, it depends how much you want it. If you want it bad enough, you'll do it. It's like, if you want to get a law degree or if you want to have a PhD, you have to go through academia, and academia is not perfect, and you can have problems or not, or somewhere in between. And most people, it's always somewhere in between, but it segs to be towards the good side of things rather than towards the bad side of things. And occasionally you hear some horrible stories, like her name, Karen Armstrong, who they didn't allow her to defend her dissertation. I think it was Oxford or Cambridge, I forgot, one of those schools. And so she forever does not have her PhD, but wrote enough books to to basically have a PhD. I don't even know if she has an honorary degree for some university, but I wouldn't be surprised after how many books she wrote. And in terms of her understanding, well, no comment there, because I'm not trying to comment on anyone, but she's a good example of what can happen.
I was thinking while you were speaking that you were leaning towards the optimistic side, not the naive side. So I thought that was good.
No, I'm not. I'm not naive about it. I mean, you know my history. I'm most certainly not naive about this. But I'm also recognizing one really important thing, which I completely omitted in pretty much all of our talks, and that is the the magic, quote unquote, side of it, the tantric side of it, and that is that there is some knowledge that you can't get without having what Castaneda called the benefactor or a guru, because your ego will just not allow it. So you need to have sometimes someone to, well, whoop your ass or grab you by the throat. And is it unpleasant? Yes, very. But it's akin to open heart surgery. The alternative is not very good. So what do you do in that situation? Well, you either do it or you don't. Well, it's the same thing like with heart surgery. You either do it and you live, or you don't do it and you die of a heart attack. Is it a good example? I don't know. It depends on the level of who you are. You know, there are some people who tiptoe around teachers never really trusting. There are people who trust too much. There are good teachers, there are bad teachers, there are abusive. Wouldn't call them teachers, and all of the above. And does it work well? Well, it depends. It depends on who you are and depends on who, you know, teacher is, etc. And believe me, about one little thing that I completely forgotten about it, spiritual knowledge and wisdom is a self-sealing thing. In other words, you cannot understand something you're not ready for, period. So if you read a book that is meant for 50-year-olds when you're 20, you will just not going to get what is in that book. It could be very entertaining, could be very interesting, but on a different level. So things like, you know, if you read Tolstoy, for example, well, several other writers, which we might, well, in English there are plenty too, you will find there are multiple meanings. You know, you will understand certain things when you're 20, certain other things when you're 30, etc. Someone like me, I've read Castaneda, several of his books, I know many times, and every time I read it, I say, oh my God, this is amazing that he's saying it, and I understand it better as I get, I shouldn't call it older, I get better, gets deeper. Well,
you want to say more experienced?
I'm not sure what it is. Yeah, maybe. Whatever. Yeah, let's call it more experienced. I mean, it's you know, it's just there's a different perspective. There's a different. Let me say this way. Say, for example, you, I don't know, walk by foot from New York to San Francisco, and you do it in I don't know, in spring or whatever. And so you go from New York, you come into New York State, which is really nice and safe and lush, and there are rain occasionally. Then you cross into hypothetically Chicago area. Please don't take this as me saying something negative about Chicago. And there you walk through Chicago and there are gangsters there and they go poof, poof, poof at you. Okay, so there, instead of looking at lush scenery, you need to be careful about the wind and the gangsters. Then you cross into prairies where the sun is big and the whole thing is flat and there's lots of cornfields. And you need to be careful about stealing corn because you can get shot by some farmer, or you may be invited by a farmer to eat a lot of corn and you're allergic to corn. Or maybe you love corn and you can get stuck in that cornfield. You may also develop this idea of having a field of dreams, like in that wonderful movie that I really like. I think it's from 1989. And you can get stuck there and you may never ever go beyond that Iowa, I think it was in Iowa, and that cornfield. And then you get to the Rockies, and there you have mountains. And in the mountains, if you go high, you may have a difficulty breathing because it's too high for you. You may also, you know, drive or walk through ice and slip and fall and break your whatever, you know, or you may get burned by the sun that is too, you know, too close because you're high in the mountains, etc. Then you know, get into California. And California is known for a really healing and amazing vibe there, and it makes you very much like a child in a womb. it has a really like that kind of vibe. But if you're trying to become independent, the California vibe is not necessarily the best thing, at least in theory. And obviously, I'm talking about hypothetical things. So at every turn, you are looking from a different perspective. So going back to academia, when you're studying pre-law, you're in college. So you have a situation of a college student. When you are in a law school, well, you have a different perspective. There's a much different focus on the subjects, including, what will be your future employment opportunities, whatever. So it's the same thing on the spiritual path. When you're young, you tend to look at the spiritual path as a project. It's like, I'm going to meditate for 10 hours a day. I'm going to, pierce my chakras, and I'll become wow, amazing realized person. I'll learn how to fly. Then you get older and you realize that this whole thing is empty. It doesn't mean anything. But the reality is, when you're younger, it means it is meaningful to you. So at that time, it is meaningful. But actually, you're trying to assert yourself. When you're older, it is meaningless because you have asserted yourself and might have failed at that. Or maybe not, or maybe you have some other perspective. So these things are, they're complex from this point of view, and that's why you need to listen less to me as a blah, blah, blah person, but ask yourself, what do you need right now? What are you looking for right now? What is important for you right now? And then you can come to me and say, okay, Anatole, I'm thinking this. What do you think about it? And I will, in my abundance of caution, wisdom, or bullshit, I can tell you, well, go and experience it yourself and don't bug me. Or if you do this, you will jump into a well with a whole bunch of frogs and very, very difficult time getting out of it. Or, you should just get married, have children, and stop bothering me. Things like that. One of my favorite jokes about how this guy comes to a rabbi and says, Rabbi, my wife is not treating me well. Well, rabbi says, okay, divorce her. Says, but she's really beautiful. He says, well, then stay with her. But she nags me all the time. Well, then divorce her. But she cooks so well. Well, then stay with her. But I don't have good sex with her. Well, then divorce her. And finally he says, you know what? Why don't you go across the street to Father Nicholas, become Christian, and stop bothering me? And that's, there's a lot of wisdom in this.
Yep.
Did I bore yourself to death?
No, I think that joke is a really great way to wrap it up.
Guys, have a very good time. Subscribe. Hit the bell. We don't have enough subscribers on this channel, so maybe you should also throw this video to different social media or something, or not. Bye.
Goodbye, everybody. I'm not out in Moab, but I enjoyed watching Moab for the course of this video.
If I don't forget, I will find another picture from Moab. Take care, guys. Bye.